you would have a lead radiation effects engineer assigned to a particular flight mission. The goal as a radiation effects engineer was you wanted your own project. You wanted to be the radiation effects lead.
This is a space-based, space-launched item.
Everybody always remembers their first project. It was a mission called ICESat-2. It's a great Earth science mission that's still going strong. Getting a chance to work on a Mars mission is just cool. Doing something interplanetary, groundbreaking in the science sense, groundbreaking in a technology context.
And Mars is such a great planet to look at. The proximity to Earth, the likelihood of potential colonization people have talked about.
There are other analogs that you can draw as well. So like our study of Earth translates to, the way that we study other planets. We're trying to find Earth-like planets in other star systems. So our study of the Earth, our study of Mars, our study of Venus, it all ends up being linked.
You were given a pretty interesting and unique opportunity to take a lot of the knowledge base that you had from the science engineering community, coupled with NASA, and translate that over to a group that sometimes speaks the same language, sometimes doesn't, which is Congress. Hey, Jonny, thanks a bunch for joining us here on Micro Journeys. Pleasure seeing you again, man. And it's too bad that it's only been, it's been a year since I saw you. So I'm glad that we're able to reconnect here in person. So thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks very much, Daniel. It's great to be here and appreciate the invite.
Yeah, so you have an interesting journey. Kind of stayed in the East Coast for most of your life, Pennsylvania, West Virginia. Ended up going to school at Vanderbilt, I believe, for your undergrad and your PhD, correct?
That's correct. Was there for undergraduate. That was intentional. I started out in the College of Arts and Science as a philosophy and classical languages major. I was always really into the humanities, felt comfortable. I took science classes in high school. I was okay at them, wasn't like a science and technology rock star coming into undergrad, but really fascinated for most of my life with space and science museums and taking things apart. Whether or not I could get them back together was maybe a little bit of a question. But when I came to Vandy, I deliberately chose. I wanted to do something in the humanities. Philosophy and classical languages was something that I was exposed to earlier in life, and so that I just sort of kept on with that. It wasn't until I guess it would have been the fall of my sophomore year, so first semester, sophomore year. Because in the College of Arts and Science at that time, you had to take, some people would call them distributional requirements, sort of broad educational foundation. So, some writing and creative expression and some philosophy, language, history, but also science and math. And I didn't want to take biology, not interested really in that at all. I was interested in physics. It was, I think kind of related to some of the questions that we would get into in philosophy class about, how does the world work the way that it does? So I was interested in that. Unfortunately, the undergraduate or freshman physics class for arts and science majors was over-enrolled. There was a huge wait list, and I had delayed registering for classes. And so I really didn't have much of a choice at that point. The only physics class that was available was the physics class for physics majors, which I was not. And so I was terrified about that. Like, what is this even going to be like? But it turned out to be perfect. The class was really small. There were only maybe 7 of us in the class, in this 2-semester freshman physics class. It was 7 of us, maybe 7, and 1 faculty member, and that was it. And all the other kids that were in the class they were all physics majors. I was the only person who at the time was still doing the philosophy and classical languages thing. But the faculty member who was teaching the class, his name was Paul, and maybe it was partway through that first semester, just had like a very frank conversation with me after class one day. He was like, "Hey, Jonny, you stay here for a minute. I want to talk to you." And told me, like, you need to be a physics major. Just like right out said it. You need to go change your major. We will look after you in the department. It'll be great.
Had you ever considered this? Or is this the first time you kind of...
No, it was like a bolt. It was very unplanned, extemporaneous, off the cuff. I mean, I think Paul had thought about it a good bit before he told me about it, but it was not something that I was tracking. This was like I needed to check the box and then move on. I thought about that. I did not change my major that semester. It was second semester of sophomore year that I had marinated on it for a while and decided, like, look, I am going to be a physics major. I really like this. I like the faculty. I like the other students that I would go through the department with. And so it was the second semester of sophomore year that I redeclared my major to physics. Along the way, I ended up picking up a minor in mathematics. That just kind of fell out because you had to take so many math courses.
They overlap so much.
Yeah, you had to take so many math classes anyway that it was kind of just a natural extension. But I was behind because I waited until the second semester of my sophomore year to change my major. There were heavy course loads after that in order to like make up the ground that I had lost before then. So, which was okay. But it was definitely like trial by fire, getting into all these other classes, things I'd heard about before, but never really sunk into. So that was a great experience. The summer between my junior and senior year, I decided to stay in Nashville for the summer, and I started doing undergraduate independent study in the physics department. And my first you got a little bit of a stipend to go with it, so that was nice. But obviously, you had to work in restaurants and do other things, to figure out how you were going to pay rent and eat and those sorts of things. But I got hooked up with two faculty members in the physics department, and they were both nuclear physicists. One was much more on the solid state electronics side of things. The other person, he was just like dyed-in-the-wool nuclear physics for most of his career, but had done a lot of software development work for like radiation transport codes and that sort of thing. And I started working in their lab. They had a small Van de Graaff accelerator, maybe like a 2 megavolt Van de Graaff accelerator. And my task with a younger grad student who was sort of like a mentor-mentee relationship, was to do Rutherford backscattering spectrometry experiments with thin films. So they would deposit like a metallic film on a piece of glass, and then you would put that into the accelerator and you would run a high energy helium beam or like alpha particles into the sample, and then you would measure the backscattered signal, which would give you information about composition, thickness, and this sort of thing. And so that was really my first experience with a particle accelerator and practical nuclear physics. But the faculty that I was exposed to because of that were also a little bit on the solid state electronics side. The one faculty member had actually worked at Bell Labs for a significant portion of his career, and he grew up in New Jersey and whatnot. And so there was a little bit of microelectronics, sprinkled in there, but it was still pretty much just hardcore physics, but learning about hands-on experimental work. That continued into my senior year when I picked up a senior thesis and moved from nuclear physics to experimental high energy physics. So, same kind of concepts, but just, up the kinetic energy. And this group was tied into an experiment at Fermi National Laboratory. At the time, the experiment was called BTEV. It was a beauty quark experiment, and they were looking at charge parity violation and these sorts of things. But they had a bunch of experimental hardware in their lab at Vanderbilt that was part of the BTEV quality assurance program. So sort of like, how do you maintain quality with the science measurements that are getting made in the interaction regions of the experiment? So you'd run the Tevatron was the big accelerator at Fermilab, TeV. The hardware that the Vanderbilt group was building was essentially proportional wire detectors, where you run a very, very thin wire in a metallic tube and you fill it with a gas, and then you put a really high voltage on that wire. And when a charged particle passes through the tube, it creates a discharge. And so you can measure the particles, you can count them. If you stack up detectors like this, you can sort of image the track. So where did the particle come from? How fast is it going? Those sorts of things. And the way that we calibrated or sort of checked that QA system for BTEV was by building and maintaining what's called like a muon telescope or a muon detector, and it measured muons, which is it's like a fat electron, or a really heavy electron, and they get generated from galactic cosmic rays hitting the Earth's atmosphere way high up, and they create the particle showers, and some of those particles are muons, and you can measure them on the ground. And you sort of think about your thumbnail as being a square centimeter, and you're getting a number of those muons even right now just going through my thumbnail.
Let's describe this for 2 seconds,
Yeah.
right? Over at Fermi, they have some of the world's best, Linacs with synchrotrons and the such that are there doing a lot of this kind of work, right? With measuring quarks, measuring muons, measuring all these different types of additional particles that you see out in space, right?
That's right.
Describe a little bit about what a muon is. You kind of talked about that a little bit, but many of the listeners may not be tracking that piece.
Yeah. So a muon is a fundamental charged particle. It's like in physics, particularly the high energy physics, people talk about it a lot. There's something called the Standard Model, and the Standard Model is essentially the foundational building blocks of matter, everything in the universe. And it's a table. It's kind of, I don't call it like a periodic table, but it's all of these building blocks, things like quarks, things like electrons, things like protons. And a muon is one of these fundamental particles. So it's a building block of matter in the universe. And it happens to be something that is, it's relatively easy to measure, relatively straightforward. They're abundant because they exist in the atmosphere, because there are these high energy particles in space that are hitting the Earth all the time. And so you're getting these showers of particles. And if you're looking for a naturally occurring source of energetic particles, muons are a pretty good thing to start with. So it's an easy way to calibrate experiments, to calibrate your experimental setup. And in fact, before people had access to particle accelerators, that's a relatively new technology. It's a 20th century, like a later in the 20th century technology. Physicists would go up on mountaintops and essentially take photographic films with them and expose them to galactic cosmic ray showers as like an early version of a natural particle accelerator. That was the way that they did particle physics for many, many years before they actually had access to these, highly controlled, tunable particle accelerators.
Oh, and I can just think about all the benefits that are associated with this, right? With the emittance of the sun, putting out everything from its standard radiation to solar flares, and seeing the peaks associated with those. I'm assuming that's something that would be measurable in what you just described, right?
Very much so. It started out with people would ride in the gondola of a balloon. And they would go up to high altitudes and take these plates with them, and then they would go up on the mountains. And so that's the way that physics, that type of experimental physics, was done for many, many years. And then, of course, it progressed into, hey, we have particle accelerators now, and you can recreate a lot of those environments on the ground and control them and get them on demand, as opposed to having to wait for natural phenomena to occur.
Repeat the same process
over and over and over again. But with muons, the muon spectrum in the atmosphere has been characterized for a very, very long time. So it's very well known. We know what the rate is. We know how to measure them. And so building this muon detector, essentially particle telescope, in a laboratory, in a building, was a really instructive experiment. I didn't understand at the time how relevant it would be down the road when I became a radiation effects engineer, and sort of the idea of connecting solar behavior or galactic cosmic rays to the things that I was measuring in a laboratory that was just one small piece of a quality assurance process for a high energy physics experiment at Fermi National Lab. Somehow all this stuff became full circle eventually. So anyway, that to move on, senior thesis work was this sort of particle telescope, put it together, make it work, and then map it into how to calibrate and sort of maintain these proportional tube detectors that were going to go to the BTEV experiment at Fermilab. Did that for my senior year and was planning to go to grad school for experimental high energy physics. I mean, I had done that my whole senior year. I really liked the people I was working with. I got introduced to all these folks at Fermilab and met people from other universities, and, not just domestic. I mean, it was a huge international collaboration. And so that was really interesting to sort of understand the science enterprise a little bit more and build your network, get the hands-on laboratory experience and whatnot. It was great. And I was all set to go to grad school, kind of staying on the physics path, until I ran across Bob Weller, who was my PhD, eventually became my PhD advisor. He was one of the folks that I had done work with at Vandy in the physics department as an undergrad. He was one of the folks that had that Van de Graaff laboratory where I was doing the Rutherford backscattering experiments. And he caught me in the hall. Maybe it was like late December, my senior year. I think I was getting ready to go home for the holidays or do something else. I was on my way out. I had like my grad school plans basically knitted up at that point. And he proceeded to tell me that at that time, Vanderbilt was trying to grow certain graduate programs. And in order to grow them more quickly, they were waiving the application fee for current Vanderbilt undergrads. So they wanted to try to capture some of their own to grow some of these grad school programs. And Bob told me about that. He's like, yeah, there's no fee. You should go to grad school at Vandy. And I was like, that's interesting. I already had like a bunch of extra letters of recommendation. I had extra transcripts. I'd already done the GRE and all these things. So it was basically at that point, like, hurry up, cut and paste, get all the application materials together. I think I took it over to one of the academic buildings where they were sort of doing the intake for grad school applications, and just dropped it off and left for the holidays. And, fast forward a few months, spring semester of senior year, started getting, final offer letters for different grad schools and whatnot. And the offer came back from Vanderbilt to join the electrical engineering and computer science department in the radiation effects research group. That was ultimately the group that I had applied to go to, because Bob had a dual appointment by that time. I think he had a dual appointment maybe for a good while between physics and electrical engineering. So he worked in both departments. And he told me, kind of the backstory on that conversation that we had, in the brief conversation we had in that hallway, December of my senior year, was, yeah, they're waiving the application fee. You should apply. And, oh, by the way, I just started doing work with this radiation effects research group in EE, electrical engineering, and they are, using particle accelerators and software simulation tools to see what happens to microelectronics when they get hit with high energy radiation.
Was this the precursor to the CREAM software that came out of Vanderbilt? Is that kind of the foundational piece here?
So the Mr. Ed, the Mr. Ed software, that is just about the time that Bob started writing Mr. Ed.
Interesting.
And he took his background from nuclear physics and like physicists developing software. He was a brilliant C and C++ software designer. Really, really good, very, very creative. And he was using that knowledge to enable the radiation effects research group, which at that point, kind of in the 2004 timeframe, 2003, 2004 timeframe, is when it really started to grow, because they had acquired faculty from other universities that were interested in the same thing, and really started to grow the size of the RER group, the Radiation Effects Research Group. And that's when Bob started writing what became Mr. Ed, by using the Geon 4 class libraries that were developed by CERN to simulate these giant high energy particle physics experiments, take those tools and apply it to radiation transport at the nanoscale for microelectronics. So he was coming into that group right about the time that he was trying to also pique my interest in, hey, you're interested in physics and particle accelerators. Here's an application of that might be super interesting for you. That's literally how that happened.
Interesting.
So like two random occurrences. One, freshman, well, really for me, it was sophomore year, physics professor says, you need to be a physics major, got me off the philosophy and classical languages track. And then random occurrence in the hall, December of my senior year, I happened to run into Bob, and he's like, told me the story about his sort of getting into radiation effects at the same time that I ended up getting into radiation effects just because of that one conversation. So pretty interesting series of occurrences, but also I think a good lesson in making sure that you're, keeping your ears open, keeping your eyes open, because you don't know when opportunities like that are going to come along. You don't know what's going to come of it. And so it was just two really good opportunities back to back that I happened to take advantage of.
Yeah, there's the path that you have in your head, and then there's the path that life presents itself.
That's right.
And you never know when it's going to happen. And I mean, those are the opportunities that, make a person's career, makes a person's life, because those opportunities are rare. They don't happen often, and you don't know when or how or if it's a good idea to seize the moment. And it's all of those things. I mean, you're really kind of betting on yourself to see, hey, is this an area that I'm interested, willing, or capable of doing? And it sounds like you just grabbed the bull by the horns and said, yeah, I can do this.
Well, yes and no. I mean, for me, of course, you don't know a priori if something's going to work out.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole thing, it could have flopped. It could have been a terrible experience. But for me, I think the way that I helped try to gauge, is this something I want to do? Is this not something that I'm interested in? Was usually based on who was it that I would get to work with. I think most of my decisions, even to this day, have been based on the team that I get to work with. How does that team feel? It's a very sort of, it's a gut feeling. It's an intuitive decision about how does this feel? And for me, getting guidance from my perception of, will I gel with those folks? Is that going to be something that will get me out of bed in the morning, keep me up at night? Because it's that interesting. But it was usually those decisions for me, and again, I think still to this day, are based on the people I get to work with and not necessarily the specifics of the technical content or the programmatic content.
And it's interesting that you talk about the team ecosystem, right? In what you're describing here for your PhD work. I mean, you're working at a university institution at Vanderbilt.
Mm-hmm.
You're working with a Department of Energy facility over at Fermi. NASA played a role in this as well, correct?
It did. I mean, in the US, the traditional supporter of high energy physics, nuclear physics, these sorts of things was, it was the Department of Energy Office of Science. Unfortunately, shortly after I left physics and transitioned over into electrical engineering, switched from physics to radiation effects research in electrical engineering, the BTEV experiment at Fermilab ended up getting canceled. They were just like changing budget priorities at that time. So, I mean, maybe in retrospect, it was a good coincidence. The thing that I was going to anchor my work to ended up, having the rug pulled out from underneath it. I moved on to radiation effects research and found, it has a kind of a different ecosystem of stakeholders that support that. There's obviously the industry angle, because there's a lot of microelectronics tends to be the focus of a lot of radiation effects research once you move up from the material level, but then also at that time, a lot of stakeholders within the space ecosystem. So Department of Defense, NASA, other R&D organizations, very, very interested in that kind of work. So it's sort of, it's a whole different community. It's a whole different professional network. And it took some time for me to get up to speed with that when I switched, decided to stay at Vandy for grad school, first big decision, and then switched disciplines. Went from physics to double E. I mean, yeah, sure. There's a lot of commonality between, like, physics is very applicable to lots of things, particularly in engineering. But when I was a physics undergrad, like, you would be handed, circuit building blocks, like, here's an op amp, here's a transistor, and you kind of treat them as a black box. It's like, I know what this does because I can use it in a lab. but actually knowing how a transistor is designed, manufactured, built, and used, or how you put a bunch of them together to make a component like an op amp. I didn't know anything about that. I didn't know anything about circuit design. Like, that was all you could gin stuff up in a lab as a physicist, because you just sort of like, use scotch tape and chewing gum for a lot of those things, and it works fine. But actually transitioning into double E, I had to take some like remedial coursework as a new PhD candidate in electrical engineering, because I didn't have any of that. I didn't have any of that background, which again, you could say was similar to some of the work that I had to do to catch up in physics, having switched from philosophy and classical languages. So some of that was similar, but it was a great experience in grad school. I spent most of my work, again, kind of mapped over from physics. It was experimental radiation effects as opposed to theoretical. So not I did do plenty of modeling and simulation, but most of my work for my master's and for my PhD was experimental, was laboratory work at the transistor, maybe few transistor level. So it was more fundamental. It wasn't so much based on circuit design and that sort of thing. At that time, I spent most of my effort on silicon germanium heterojunction bipolar transistors, or SiGe HBTs. I did a lot of work, collaborative work with Georgia Tech and the folks there. It was nice physical proximity. Spent a lot of time driving back and forth between Atlanta and Nashville. But it was good. It was a good community that mapped into, obviously, plenty of other things came along with CMOS, plenty of work on that side. But, SiGe HBTs were a really interesting technology to work with, still relevant. At that time, there were a lot of questions about how would SiGe HBTs respond to radiation. Could you figure out ways to design with them reliably to deploy in space and whatnot? And so there was a very rich area for grad school work at that time, and it was a lot of fun. The radiation effects research group at Vandy continued to do well, and I think, again, as you kind of alluded to a few minutes ago, kind of set me up for the next stage in my career in terms of transitioning out of grad school into a professional job. One of the stakeholders for some of my graduate work was NASA. They had a grant with Vandy from a program out of NASA called the NASA Electronic Parts and Packaging Program, and there were several other government agencies that were funding my work through grad school. So it was sort of setting up those professional connections within the space radiation effects ecosystem while you were in grad school. And of course, you would go to program reviews and you would present there, and you go to conferences and present. And it was, the radiation effects group, even globally, is still relatively small. We all know each other. It's like a big extended family. And that was really how a lot of those connections got built and made early on, was through the program work from the sponsoring organizations.
NEP is a great example because there was a ripple effect on the influence that set of work ultimately influenced outside of NASA, right? So I mean, personally, from the defense microelectronics activity, we would look at some of the publications and research that you guys were doing at NEP, because ruggedized electronics, with everything from high reliability to radiation effects to even synergistic effects, and how those things are, impacting all of the different systems that are out there, not just space systems. Or even if it is space systems, is it a commercial set of research that's influencing national security, influencing, civil? So all of these pieces are kind of tied together. So as you're kind of now navigating your next chapter in life over at NASA, sounds like knee deep in the mission assurance portion of the portfolio. What was, I guess, how did your ascent happen within NASA? You started out doing a lot of this research, became a very well-known person within, like you said, this small community, but that by extension became the face of quite a bit of radiation effect related activities over at NASA. How did the ascent happen while you were there?
Yeah, it's good. It's a good question. So I kind of already alluded to the fact that I was doing some sponsored research work for NASA through the NEP program while I was a grad student. And as I was finishing up grad school and getting ready to sort of like, what does Jonny want to do professionally? I looked at options in industry. I looked at options within FFRDCs. I looked at options within government, and was getting all kinds of advice from mentors and advisors and family members about, oh, you should do this, you should do that.
People don't lack in the advice category.
Oh, no, not at all. There are a lot of sources of advice, a lot of things to weed through. One of my PhD committee members, he wasn't my official PhD advisor, but I spent a long time in grad school working with him. His name was Robert Reed, and Robert formerly worked at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, and had come to Vanderbilt as a research faculty member in 2004, which is when I started grad school at Vanderbilt. And he had an interest in SIGI HBTs. He was doing work on that. So was I. And so we kind of developed a natural alliance. And I think Robert gave me pause several times with his advice about the idea of going into the civil service and sort of like what it meant to be a civil servant, and why you should seriously consider the idea of, for instance, going to NASA to work. And ultimately, I think, his calculus with that, I think it resonated with me. I understood where he was coming from, and it spoke to me in a way that I think was very powerful and left a strong impression. And that was one of the primary reasons I think that I decided to ultimately take an engineering position, an entry-level engineering position at the Goddard Space Flight Center. So I started at Goddard as technically I started as a physicist at Goddard. That was the position description that I was on, which I thought was interesting. That was November of 2008. And shortly thereafter, I ended up officially converting over to be an aerospace engineer. But of course, that's just like position description, designations, and whatnot. But I did start out as a physicist, as opposed to an engineer, which I enjoyed. My work at NASA mirrored, I don't want to say it was identical to the work that I was doing as a grad student, but very, very similar. It was radiation effects research and professional sort of like radiation effects engineering work, where we would have the way that you would formulate a flight project at NASA, for instance. You would have a lead radiation effects engineer assigned to a particular flight mission, and that was sort of what you would aspire to be. You would work under somebody's wing for a little bit, sort of understand this is the way the flight project process works, from, formulation and preliminary design and final design and integration and test and launch and ops and whatnot. But the goal as a radiation effects engineer was to, sort of, you wanted your own project. You wanted to be the radiation effects lead for a project.
And when you say for a project, this isn't just a laboratory project that is done at some national facility. This is a space launched item, whether it be a satellite, whether it be a rover, something where you start from the inception of the concept and you carry it through all the way, and that basically encompasses your legacy as it relates to being an engineer supporting NASA or a NASA mission. Do I have that right?
That's correct. So when I say a project, it's a project like, the Global Precipitation Measurement Mission, or the MAVEN mission that's at Mars now, or the OSIRIS-REx mission that, did asteroid sample return. There are a whole host of others that I had a chance to work on. But the goal was, as a radiation effects engineer, was to get a project so that you could be really that person for radiation effects from cradle to grave. And you would follow that mission all the way through, including operations. If they would have anomalies or whatnot, you might get called to help them unpack something like that. But it was really, that was like the full application of your knowledge that you had built and gathered over time, was to be able to apply it to a real mission in a particular environment and sort of help the project sort through all those different design changes, challenges, testing, evaluation, production, integration, test, launch, ops, and whatnot. So pretty interesting to get to do that for multiple different missions, low Earth orbit, interplanetary space, going to Mars, going to the moon.
Is there a particular mission that you were involved in that really stands out for one reason or another?
The one was sort of my first project, because I think everybody always remembers their first project, was a mission called ICESat-2. Its primary function is as a space-based topographic lidar. ICESat-2 is still operating. It's a great Earth science mission that's still going strong. But that was my first mission, so I'll always remember that one. The other one that stands out, just because it was a lot of fun and it was challenging, was MAVEN. That's a Mars orbital mission that was trying to understand. It has since made a lot of discoveries and progress in trying to figure out what happened to Mars's atmosphere. Mars used to have an atmosphere; it doesn't anymore. What happened to it? Or it has much less of an atmosphere, for instance, than Earth does. And so it was an atmosphere evolution mission trying to sort of unpack and decode what had happened. And so getting a chance to work on a Mars mission is just cool, doing something interplanetary, and not just sort of like a stock and trade, like, hey, we're going to do, sun sync in Leo, which is still really interesting because, the kind of missions that NASA does, they tend to be one-offs. It's not production. We're not doing the same thing over and over again. It's always, groundbreaking in the science sense, groundbreaking in a technology context. So even like a garden variety instrument that's going to get bolted onto the International Space Station is still going to be fun to work on. There's always interesting challenges that come up with that, though maybe not as quote unquote interesting from a radiation effect standpoint, because the environment might be more benign, but a benign environment might allow you to push much harder on the technologies that you want to fly because you can get away with more.
And Mars is such a great planet to look at within our own solar system, right? I mean, the proximity to Earth, the likelihood of potential colonization people have talked about. I mean, there's the findings that we have with different rovers that are looking at, are there any kind of precipitation that might have been left over?
Yeah.
Does that have the foundations of potential life, which is one of the big questions that people have about space, right? Is there life outside of Earth? And if there is, how do we detect it? How complex is it? And all of those different types of things kind of go back to what you're describing here with Mars related missions, right? Is there an atmosphere, and how is that atmosphere impacting the findings we have today? How do we connect those dots, right?
Yeah. And I think there's also, there are other analogs that you can draw as well. So like our study of Earth as the home planet translates to, the way that we study other planets. The way that we study other planets can produce lessons learned for how the Earth might evolve, going forward. So the linkages there are, there are quite a few. And then, of course, there are extensions for, now we have missions that usually fall in the astrophysics category, where we're looking at, planets in other star systems. Like, we're trying to find Earth-like planets in other star systems. So our study of the Earth, our study of Mars, our study of Venus, other things, other could be rocky bodies or gas giants in our own solar system, then translate to studying those exoplanets outside of our own system. It all ends up being linked.
Yeah, proximity to their native star. Is it in the habitable zone?
Correct.
And do those kinds of things give the precursors to, once again, is there other life, right? Is there another Earth planet out there somewhere that is allowing us to, not only, like you said, lessons learned that we can take back and help understand our own evolution and what, life here is on Earth. So with all of that kind of impact into not only space, radiation research, different specific programs at NASA, you were given a pretty interesting and unique opportunity to take a lot of the knowledge base that you had from the science engineering community, coupled with NASA, and translate that over to a group that sometimes speaks the same language, sometimes doesn't, which is Congress. And how did that come to be? And what was your experience like there?
Sure. So, I had done the radiation engineering professional job for a number of years. and continued to sort of take on different roles within NASA. I, was a supervisor for a little while, first line and a second line supervisor for a little while. But I always maintained my connection to the radiation effects community. I never let that go. I took a lot of grief maybe earlier in my career when I first decided I was going to become a supervisor. And people, oh, you're giving up your ability to do technical work. You've gone to the dark side.
Yep, you're on the management track.
Oh yeah,
you're going to lose touch of all of your skill set.
That's right. But there were also, mentors and advocates that were telling me like, you do you, and the things that are important to you, you will find a way to continue to prioritize them. So I maintained the connection with the technical work and never really gave it up. Though these days, I'd be hard pressed to be allowed back in the lab, and I'm not putting on a wrist strap anytime soon for ESD protection. But went through, did those sort of supervisory, like line management roles, and then eventually I want to say it was probably like October of 2017, I had an opportunity to become the NASA microelectronics manager. So sort of take over the microelectronics capability for the agency writ large, which was separate from the NASA electronic parts and packaging program. This was more, the NASA microelectronics manager was more of it's like an institutional role, which is, does the agency have the right skill mix, access to the right capabilities to answer the questions that are going to get put before it. It could be human exploration, space technology, science missions, aeronautics, what have you. NEP, of course, was a part of that. The flight projects work was a part of that, but it was more like, is the agency equipped to do the things that it has to in order to meet national objectives and those sorts of things? And it was in that job that I started getting more exposed to policy work and kind of like the way that the agency operates.
Because is it because you had now a larger purview of the NASA portfolio, or was it because of a different piece, right? Because before that, you were focused mostly on Goddard specific stuff, right? This now gave you insight into the bigger NASA ecosystem. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, we dealt with, through the NASA electronic parts and packaging program, we dealt with multiple NASA centers. If you were doing research for NEP, you were going to be collaborating with other NASA personnel at other NASA centers. We were going to be working with the Jet Propulsion Lab. We were going to be working with other government agencies. We were going to be working with the academic community, the international community. I mean, that was one of the things that was really interesting about NEP. I mean, yeah, it generates knowledge, provides guidance, helps support standards, but NEP also was a really, really powerful it had a really, really powerful convening function in order to get people together from around the United States and from around the world to talk about these, just gnarly problems with reliable use of microelectronics in space. And there were a lot of people that wanted to have that conversation. So the convening function of NEP, which I had been exposed to, again, all the way back to grad school, that carried through. So I had some sense of broader NASA operations, but it really wasn't until I took on this NASA microelectronic manager role in 2017 that I got a much bigger window and more purview over other parts of the agency and agency operations and that sort of thing. And that access to that role was really precipitated by a NASA leadership development program that I was in. I had completed it not that long before then. It was called the Mid-Level Leader Program, MLLP, and it was the agency conducted it for a number of years, but it was a really cool opportunity where you got to do, as part of that development program, you got to do a detail assignment within the agency. And that was really based on what you could negotiate. And I did my detail at NASA headquarters in the Office of the Chief Financial Officer. I worked in an organization called the Strategic Investments Division, or SID. And SID was an interesting organization. They had a policy function. They had some like cost estimating and analysis functions. I was more on the policy side of SID and had at that time an opportunity to work on the agency strategic plan. And this is like the official required by statute strategic plan for the agency that it does every 4 years. We still do it every 4 years. And it was working on, at that time, the 2018, what were the bones of the 2018 strategic plan.
This is the whole NASA strategic plan.
The whole for the whole agency. And so I was leading this agency-wide working group on my detail to put together again the draft framework for what became the 2018 strategic plan. So I finished that up and then came back to Goddard from the headquarters detail, and then took over on this microelectronics manager role. So from the 2017 onward, I was looking at the agency from, kind of big picture, looking down into the agency, looking across all the NASA centers. And the engineer part of me continued to puzzle around the question of like, why do we work the way that we work? Why do we get funded in a particular way or not funded in a particular way? And so it was just that the questioning, why does this work the way that it does? And so it took me several, I sort of continued on as the NASA microelectronics manager. I continued on as the deputy program manager for NEP at the same time. So I was sort of dual hatted for a few years. And it was in the early 2020s that I started taking outside leadership development classes because it was convenient through Brookings, and because most of their classes were in DC. I lived in DC. It was easy to do because of no travel money, and so logistically it was like, okay, well, I'm gonna do a day or a week of training or whatnot. And one of the people that I met in a Brookings training class told me about a program, a fellowship program that Brookings ran called Legis. The Brookings Legis Fellowship Program. And Legis was a program that Brookings had run for many years that was a pathway to legislative fellowships in Congress. And I'd never thought about something like that before. The idea of learning more about Congress, I took training programs on congressional operations and White House operations and whatnot, just to be, a better civil servant, to understand more about the way the federal government actually works on a day-to-day basis. But I had never considered the idea of, well, you could do a congressional fellowship. Like that was just, kind of blew my mind a little bit. As an engineer and this radiation effects hardcore person, all the way to, you can essentially do a detail, or in this case, a fellowship in Congress. And so it took me a couple years to figure out how I could actually get that done. How was I going to pay for my salary? How was I going to, backfill my job jar while I was gone? I couldn't just like abandon the things that I was doing. Because this for me was something that I wanted to pursue organically. There wasn't an agency call for people to participate in this Brookings Legis Fellowship. This was like, Jonny wants to go do this. How am I going to make it happen?
Yeah.
And so that took some convincing. I had to convince my own management chain that I actually had a plan that was executable. Like if I disappear for a year, how is all this stuff still going to get done? How am I going to make sure that my salary is paid for? How am I going to make sure that the multiple people that were backfilling my job jar, how are they going to get paid to do that work? Because like you can't double one FTE. You got to find another pot of resources to cover that. So that took a little bit of organizing to do, but ultimately I did come up with a plan. Like this is how this can happen, and got everybody onto the same page. And that is when I applied to the Brookings Legis program in the fall of 2021 to do that. Got into the Brookings Legis program, and through the orientation process, this multi-week thing, I had applied for the 12-month version of Legis. They also offered at that time a 7-month version, which was like January to July instead of January through December or into January the next year. So I started going through the orientation late 21, early 2022, January 22. So this would have been for the second session of the 117th Congress. And the way that Brookings does their program, it's like speed dating.
Okay.
Brookings, because they do this program every year, they've got their own, sort of list of contacts within personal offices, committees, House, Senate.
And when you say contacts, are these congressional contacts or are these MLA? Where are the contacts?
They're professional staff members
Okay.
in personal offices and professional staff members on committees.
Okay.
But of course, you're not limited to that. But that's sort of like they literally set up speed dating.
Yep.
And the giant room, and you go around. They teach you how to write. Brookings will teach you how to write a congressional resume, which is very different, particularly as like an engineer or somebody coming out of like academic scientific work. Congressional resume is very different because the kind of skills that you're highlighting are very different than your technical skills. It's much more about, communication and writing ability.
Yeah, not a lot of interest in semiconductor physics and particle physics, right?
Much to my disappointment. And there's really this sort of like crashing reality when you get into the Brookings oriented. And Brookings, of course, is not the only organization that does this. There are a lot of different organizations around DC that offer congressional fellowships, and they're just really, really great people that sort of keep that tradition alive and open up Congress to new perspectives, and having these folks that are going to come in for 6 months or a year. Some of them turns into multiple year fellowships if they can negotiate that. But it's just jarring in terms of cultural adaptation of somebody that has not been on the Hill before. You sort of admired Congress from a distance, but you've never really sort of like been down in the trenches and the way that it works.
And the speed that it works.
And the speed that it works at, and, how the dynamic range of Congress, of a staff member in Congress is really, really wide. Some days are just like completely crazy. Other days, maybe a little bit slower, but even a slow day on the Hill is still pretty busy. But yeah, just like the way that you have to communicate, the way that you have to advertise yourself. Like, what are you bringing to the office? What are you bringing to the committee? How are you going to help them as a fellow? I mean, in some sense, you get a leg up because you're no cost to them. It's free labor for a fellow, but you still have to, what's your value proposition?
Yep. There has to be a value add because decisions have to be made, votes will be made, taxpayer dollars will be spent, and there has to be a way to justify working backwards. Why did we spend taxpayer dollars? Right. Why was the decision and the vote made? And how was it made?
Well, not only that, but you're also, I mean, regardless of whether you're in a personal office or in a committee, you're also an extension, a representative extension of the member. And so there's that part of the calculus that goes into it as well. So anyway, I had gone through the speed dating, and I really wasn't sure. Did I want to go to the House or the Senate? And they, Brookings provided a lot of guidance, helpful suggestions. Culturally, the House operates this way. Culturally, the Senate operates this way. Personal office versus committee. Because I was coming to the Hill with a background in microelectronics and space, and I did really want to figure out a way to leverage my technical capability in Congress. It was fairly clear to me early on that I wanted to pursue a committee assignment as opposed to a personal office assignment. I wasn't opposed to doing a fellowship in a personal office, but that wasn't really the set of objectives that I wanted to meet by going to the Hill. Ultimately, after a lot of discussions and, after work coffees, before work coffees, just trying to network and figure out where to land, I ended up taking a selection, or I guess taking a position as a fellow, legislative fellow, on the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, specifically the Space and Science Subcommittee. The committee structure of Senate CST is a little bit different these days, but at that time, second session of the 117th Congress, there was a Space and Science Subcommittee. And at that time, January 2022, it was just, again, it was, how did I fall into the opportunity? That was right at the time when the Senate and the House were going to start working together to negotiate what ultimately became the Chips and Science Act. The prior summer, the Senate had passed the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, USICA. The House had not passed a companion bill yet. That happened in early February of 2022 when the House passed the America Competes Act of 2022, which was their version of what the Senate had done with USICA. They were similar in many respects, but they also had, their fair share of differences. And the goal was really, once the House had passed Competes, was to form a real conference committee to try to figure out how we're going to jam these two pieces of legislation together. And so my assignment, my tasking as a fellow on Senate Commerce was to focus on, I spent most of my time focusing on the CHIPS portion and the NIST reauthorization that was in ultimately what became Chips and Science. So it was CHIPS, NIST reauth, and then supporting other folks who were on the committee working the NSF reauthorization, working research security, and then there was also a NASA reauthorization in Chips and Science. So it was, there was a lot to get done, and that was one of those just extended periods of time, because it was a 6 or 7 day a week job from January through the 9th of August when Chips and Science ultimately got, I think it was the 9th of August. Let's say early August. But I think it was the 9th, got signed into law. It was just like all go, no quit. And then even after Chips and Science became a law, then it was immediately turning around into implementation and oversight of implementation. And then on top of, in addition to that, there were also, hearings on all kinds of different things that the committee was involved in. There were, and those could have been technical hearings on new topics for new legislation. They could have been oversight hearings for existing legislation. They could have been hearings to confirm presidential nominees. So all of that was happening while we were also trying to get Chips and Science done.
And there was a lot of political motivation behind Chips and Science. I mean, I remember Secretary Raimondo coming out with a number of either press releases or video things saying that she's encouraging Congress to move fast on making a decision on this. And I mean, you even had the semiconductor ecosystem signing letters of support on why this was needed. I mean, I think the letter that went over to Congress had 50 or so CEOs all signing. I mean, and they were the top tier people, right? I mean, these were from the largest companies, but it didn't ignore some of the smaller companies. It was a pretty comprehensive list of things. So there was a lot of, I don't want to call it pressure, but a lot of eyes on what is Congress going to do?
Mm-hmm.
Are they going to move this forward or are they not? And how important are they putting microelectronics into the overall set of, decisions that they're making with nominees, like you said, with budgets, all these different types of pieces. So it was a very interesting time, especially within the ecosystem that we live in the microelectronics space.
It was, it was a really fascinating time to be in Congress, though I think, anybody that spends any time on the Hill, either as, an external stakeholder, trying to influence decisions, or somebody that, as a staff member that's actually embedded in the Hill as, permanent staff, as a detailee, as a fellow like I was, it's always interesting. It's a really, really unique environment to be in, to understand how, you think back to Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law. The reality of the way that happens, it's impossible to describe accurately unless you've actually done it. You can talk about the individual pieces, but how everything comes together and the way relationships matter, the way that, bicameral relationships matter, the way that relationships with external stakeholders matters. I think that was the time in my life when I really kind of got a much better understanding of the role of a government relations person on the outside, in terms like what's the what's the real context and skill behind being a GR person at a company, or you might work for a trade association. You might be
Trade association like an SIA or something like
sure,
that. Yeah.
yeah, an industry trade association, or like a trade association, or an affinity group that represents universities, because obviously Chips and Science had a bunch of authorizing language for NSF in it,
Yep.
which was huge for the academic community.
Working with PACs, super PACs.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
But I think I also got like a much better appreciation of, let's just say, like lobbyists in general. I mean, I was always, you would always think like, oh, lobbyist.
Yeah.
But just a really valuable set of stakeholders in terms of the role that they play in the legislative process, and how congressional staff learn details of things that, like, you're just one person. There's no way for you to be an expert in everything that falls into the committee's jurisdiction. And so just, I think, getting a better appreciation for the way that process works, and ultimately how Article 1, the Congress, ends up interacting with Article 2, the executive branch. What's that relationship like? What's that relationship like as legislation that affects government agencies evolves, as well as those external stakeholders? So it was a really good educational experience. Again, some of the stuff, it's a snapshot in time. If you left Congress and you came back a year later, or 2 years later, or 10 years later, you'd have a different experience. But just a lot of really valuable takeaways to be a better, more effective contributor to whatever organization you're involved with. After you leave the Hill, you're going to walk away with skills and experiences that are going to be important in whatever role you decide to take on after that.
And did this portion of your career also dovetail into some of the work that you did for the Executive Office of the President? Was that an overlapping piece, or was that something that was separate and aside?
I would say that it was separate, related in time only, and that they ended up being consecutive. Once we got Chips and Science done, I mean, the headline part of that, at least, for somebody coming out of the microelectronics community, was the chips portion of Chips and Science. Almost, what was it? Almost $53 billion in appropriations through Chips and Science, and then a lot of authorizing language for many federal agencies, sort of for the overall federal R&D enterprise and the stakeholder communities that work with that. So finished up on the Hill as a Brookings Fellow in January of 2023, after spending my year up there, and was planning on coming back to NASA, because I was still a NASA employee. I'd never left NASA. And so, was coming back to Goddard, which was, had been my home since I came to NASA, other than the detail I did to CFO at headquarters. And right about that time, there was a process that had opened up as I was sort of transitioning off the Hill. There was a detail opportunity that had been advertised internal to NASA to be the director of civil space policy for the National Space Council. At that time, NASA sort of had, I don't want to say first right of refusal, but was typically the agency that provided the civil space policy person for the National Space Council, since it was reinvigorated a couple administrations ago now. And so that detail advertisement was open, and I think, being on one end of Pennsylvania Avenue, it was a really interesting opportunity to potentially have the chance to go to the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue and kind of understand how the two branches of the federal government operate with each other from that perspective, which of course is different than the perspective of being down and in with an agency. So There was also a bit of a delay, a little bit of a lag because, it was a pretty extensive interview process. There were, multiple folks from within NASA that were competing for the opportunity to have that policy director position as a detailed job. And then, of course, there's just the additional interviews that you have to do, multiple within NASA, multiple with folks inside of EOP and on the Space Council to try to decide again, like what's the value proposition? Just like the Hill, what do you bring into the table, and is it what we need now, ultimately? And so it took a few months for that to play out. But I did end up getting offered the detail opportunity to be the director of civil space policy on the National Space Council, and that got started in the late spring of 2023, and it was a year long. So it went from late spring of 23 to late spring of 2024, and at that time, again, because all these are like end up being snapshots in time, there were several policy directors that would sit on the National Space Council. Most of us were detailees, would come from other federal agencies, and so you're contributing your services for a period of time. There were some permanent EOP employees who weren't detailed, but a good number of us were detailees. So you'd have like a director of civil space policy, a director of national security space policy, a director of commercial space policy, director of international space policy, and then a director of space STEM and workforce policy. And then some additional administrative staff members and whatnot. And then, obviously you've got political appointees and that sort of thing. So, but a very different environment from working on the Hill. The interesting thing was when I started the Brookings Fellowship with Senate Commerce on the Space and Science Subcommittee, I actually wanted to work on space stuff from the legislative perspective, but because chips and science was the thing at that time, there wasn't a whole lot of space to focus on, space stuff to focus on. We got to do a few things, and obviously there was like a skinny NASA authorization in the Chips and Science Act, but there wasn't a whole lot of space stuff. We get some hearings on space and that type of thing, but it was not all space all the time every day.
Yeah, but with someone with your background, right? You have not only the space background, but you have the microelectronics background as well.
Yep.
So you have a dual threat for Congress. So when their topic du jour comes around, it can fall into one of those two categories. I'm assuming that's kind of the situation that presented itself, right?
Yeah, that's really kind of how it worked. And there was with me working on the Space and Science Subcommittee at the time, there actually was a NASA detailee that through a formal detail channel as opposed to the fellowship channel, which I could have ended up anywhere. Typically when Congress, gets a detailee from an agency, someone from the committee phones up the agency and, says like, we would like a detailee from the agency. And then they go through a process to figure out who that's going to be. So there was already a NASA person on the subcommittee. And she had gotten there a few months before I arrived, and so was already kind of doing a really, really. She's great, great colleague and friend, even to this day. She was already doing a really good job of holding down a lot of the space stuff, but there was a gap for coverage on the microelectronics side, and so that was just like a logical fit for me at that time. But then, obviously, leaving that and going over to Space Council, it was space all the time, every day. But no microelectronics.
Interesting.
I was really, coming off of doing chips and science, I really thought that I could figure out a way to have more room to work from a policy perspective of more explicitly linking microelectronics and space. But that turned out to be a lot harder than I was expecting, even though anybody that does microelectronics, avionics systems, payload systems, microelectronics is like the cross-cutting enabler that makes all of that possible. It's one of the cross-cutting enablers that makes all of that possible. But from a policy perspective, at that time, there weren't a whole lot of perches that you could get on that would allow you to think about running a policy process or running a dialogue process to talk about space and microelectronics. It was just sort of manifest, but there wasn't a whole lot at that time. There wasn't a whole lot of appetite to sink effort into that. But at any rate, spent a year on Space Council doing executive branch policy work and sort of, similar group of stakeholders to Congress, but different. And I think that it was, again, really, really valuable from, in its own way, particularly, I think, to have those experiences back to back.
So now you've taken a tour through, Congress, working at the executive office of the president. Kind of a two-part question here. First one is what's keeping you busy today, and where do you see your legacy as it relates to the impact of the overall space community?
Yeah, I mean, so after I finished up on Space Council again, kind of a debate, what's Jonny going to go do now? Ultimately, I opted to go back to the Goddard Space Flight Center again, like has been home base. I think what I said earlier in the discussion was November of 2008. Was a long time ago, and had the opportunity, I think, to try to put all of these learnings and experiences to work. What am I going to do? What am I going to do with all that? And so the position that I'm in now, I mean, it has kind of a generic title. It's the executive lead for strategic partnerships. What that really means is looking at, knowing NASA's mission priorities, looking across government and understanding where the synergies happen between the things that we need to get done and how those relate to and are similar to mission objectives, again, across the federal government. And then the key to that is then understanding how can we use those synergies to gain a couple of things out of it. One is like you want mutual benefit because you want it to be good value for the taxpayer, but then also how can we use those opportunities, those synergies between organizations to grow existing commercial markets and create new commercial opportunities that might not otherwise exist if you have one agency, blinders on, charging ahead with its own objectives. I think having the perspective that I did as the NASA microelectronics manager, really kind of knowing and understanding the DNA across the agency and the different field centers and their stakeholders, from the legislative perspective, very, very broad environment and set of stakeholders, understanding from the EOP point of view and executive branch policy, and how to translate that into something that's tangible, producing deliverables, I think gave me a pretty unique appreciation for how, at the implementation level, can you do things operationally? How can you operationalize these different perspectives, knowing that they change? Congress's opinions and perspectives change, EOP's perspectives and opinions and policies change, and you have to be nimble and responsive to that. But at the same time, get the mission done. And so I think my role now is affording me the opportunity to take all of that learning and those perspectives, and you got to get the mission done on time, on budget, those sorts of things always, but end up with something where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And it's a real chance to do that and practice it. And it's super exciting. Because I get to work with all of those same communities from my perspective now, and sort of leverage those experiences and those networks, and make them work ultimately for the American people, which is, it is a good thing. It's, as I said before, it gets me up in the morning and it keeps me up at night. And I think, looking back on it, maybe 5 years, 10 years from now, I hope that one of the takeaways will be that, if you're a hardcore technical person, that you can look at, a career path as, I guess the analogy that always was told to me was like, think about it like a subway map. You're here in DC, think of it like the Metro map. You might be on the green line for a little while. You might take a turn onto, orange, blue, or silver. Then you'll go through an interchange and like maybe you want to get on the red line. Maybe you want to go back to the green line, all the way back to, oh, you became a supervisor, you're giving up on technical. Well, I didn't. You came back around.
There's a fluidity.
There is. It's a continuous process, and all of this stuff has come full circle. I think in almost every instance, all the way back to, the freshman physics class that I took the first semester of sophomore year. Started playing around with particle accelerators. Particle accelerators, was a sort of a first foray into radiation effects, which became, first exposure to solid state electronics, to microelectronics. NEP exposing me to NASA, which became a career path. Those different career paths at NASA led me to asking questions, why does a thing work the way that it works? Just the same as when I was a kid, pulling apart a refrigerator and maybe not being able to get it back together again, but just like tinkering with things and asking why, and, coming up over time with better and better answers to that. And now sort of being in a position where I feel like I can affect outcomes. I can, pursue things that are good for NASA, good for the nation, good for the public writ large. And I think prove, what some people are actually investing a lot of time into now, which is there is a role for policy and legislative knowledge if you are a technical person. And it's good for the policy and the legislative ecosystems to have real technical people in those ecosystems, and not just assume that these are different silos that don't ever cross with each other. And I think you're starting to see more of that now, where colleges, universities, are having academic programs that are explicitly blending technical work and technical education with policy education and policy perspectives. And the two of those put together is a really, really powerful combination that I think engineers, scientists, researchers are going to want to fuse more often going forward. I think there's definitely a growth path for that.
And I think that diversification strengthens a person's utility in a specific field. Yours is the space community, yeah. But not staying in one track, exploring areas, like you said, on the subway, where you might get off, but you might get back on. And maybe you have to sit on one of them for a little bit longer than expected. It doesn't necessarily mean that that is the only way of transportation for the rest of your career. There are multiple ways to transition around, learn new things, and build on those kinds of opportunities. So I'll circle back with a comment you made and kind of lead into our last question here. You said, within the next 5 or 10 years. That was one of the comments you made, kind of the legacy question of where do you see your career? Flipping that around, not so much for you personally, but where do you see the biggest technological challenge in the next few years? I would say not limited to just space. It can be microelectronics. It can be space. But where do you see the big hurdle that is either looming or we are facing right now?
Yeah, obviously, and this comment is, Jonny's personal opinion. I'm not sure which it will be, but the two that I think about a lot, during the day, or maybe when I'm driving home from work at night, I'm not sure which will win, or maybe if you ask me tomorrow, I'd give a different answer. One is, and I have two answers to your question. One is, I think, high capacity, resilient, deep space transportation and communication. I mean, all the stuff that we're thinking about right now, pushing towards the moon onto Mars, and that could be in a commercial capacity. It doesn't even need to be in a government capacity, is going to require a lot more transportation and comm capability than we have right now. That communication capability is going to need to be um, tolerant of delays and interference. It's going to need, we're going to need much more advanced propulsion systems. I think you've heard a lot of comments recently and a lot of interest around space nuclear capabilities. And that has all sorts of interesting implications for radiation effects on microelectronics in addition to the space environment. I mean, I'm super interested in following that just as a devotee of radiation effects. I mean, that's like the ultimate interest if you want to have, a radiation source in addition to the space radiation environment. Of course, we have experience with that in civil systems, but those were, passive uh, passive radiation sources where you'd have, a general purpose heat source or something like that, and you're sort of running your system off of the waste heat from decay, as opposed to a fission reactor. It's a very different environment, but it's going to be some super interesting capabilities and challenges associated with that. But thinking about the thing that we're after is this high capacity, resilient deep space transportation and comm. Because of course, if you put more assets further away from Earth, you also need ways to talk to them, and not at a low rate. Particularly if you have people and other robotic assets that are going to go along with that. The other one, and again, I'm not sure which rises to the top. It's probably going to depend on the day of the week, the month of the year, is the long-term sustainability of space. As we continue to put more and more capabilities into space, how do we make sure that that does not become self-limiting? And so that's, thinking about things like much better space situational awareness, space domain awareness, thinking about, how to mitigate and cure things like unintended electromagnetic radiation. So sort of like unintended emissions from systems. There's debris mitigation, debris remediation, all the things that fall into those buckets. So, as we continue to explore, as we continue to discover, as we continue to create new commercial markets, we want that growth to be maintained and not to end up being self-limiting. And that could be near the Earth, that could be in cislunar space, that could be at Mars, eventually other parts of the solar system.
I'm thinking of the story of The Martian when you're saying this, right? Andy Weir, I believe, is the author of that, and there's this habitat that they've established, and everything is going harmonious. I mean, the guy, he's stranded there. He's growing potatoes. He's living. He's waiting for the right amount of souls to come around, and then space is unpredictable. And out of nowhere, he starts getting all of this, debris that's hitting his, local place, unpredicted. So the situational awareness you're describing and the survivability is something that is unknown. I mean, being able to predict these kinds of things will have substantial impact on how effective we are in space, colonizing new locations, and being able to continue our exploration beyond our solar system. These are all different kinds of pieces that are really kind of big questions that you're posing here. So, Jonny, I really appreciate the time here. It's a pleasure speaking with you. As always, I learned so much from you when I chat with you. So looking forward to it again, man. And thanks a bunch for joining us here on Microjourneys.
I really appreciate that. Thank you, Daniel, for the opportunity.